I know what you guys are thinking. Why did it take so long for me to do another video in my birthday suit? What's up guys, and welcome back to the channel. My name is Franco Allo, and this channel is all about knife knowledge, reviews, unboxings, and head-to-heads. Today, as you can tell, I am in my birthday suit, and it is no coincidence. Just a few weeks back, I turned the tender age of 36. And so today is going to be about this gorgeous Shun Classic 150mm petty made out of VG10. Spoiler alert, I received this knife 20 years ago, and so that's what we're celebrating today. I turned 36 a few weeks ago. I've had this knife for 20 years. Math wizards out there, how old was I when I got my first Japanese kitchen knife? 16. And so today isn't going to be a food demo. It's not going to be a knife review. It's going to be about why I am the person that I am today, why I am knife obsessed as I am, and recognizing that it all started with this knife. So maybe a little bit of background. There will be essentially also, as I talk and describe how this knife came to be, came into my life, how things got out of hand, around what age things got out of hand. But as I talk about this knife and others, I'm going to try to make it a bit interactive since there's no food demo or knife review, and I will have some pictures up on screen. So, some fun facts. I've been obsessed with Japan for 22 years. Again, for the math wizards out there, that's correct, I was 14. I got my first Japanese kitchen knife 20 years ago, so when I was 16. Things really got out of hand 7 or 8 years ago. And there was a big switch there, and we'll talk about what that switch was. Also, fun fact, I've been into photography. I've been practicing the art of photography for 15 years. And so, funny enough, though I've had this knife for 20, and I've been doing photography for about 15, I went through my external hard drive where I keep all the images I've ever taken ever since I got my first DSLR, which was a Canon Rebel XT in 2007. And I barely found any pictures of this. So this knife has been in my life for the longest amount of time out of all other knives in my collection, because of course it was the first one. But I also have so few pictures of it that when I finally found a picture of it, it was the most, not off-putting picture, but let's just say it wasn't exactly a shining example of what this knife can do. You'll see it up on screen. It's essentially a banana bread loaf with chai seeds. Of course, it's chocolate chip banana bread loaf. And there my knife is, just kind of hanging out. I used this petty to slice it because that's what I had at the time. And I couldn't find any other pictures, so maybe I'll take a few new pictures and put up on screen. It definitely has a lot of sharpening or whetstone bites from learning to sharpen. Back then I sharpened with a Shun combination stone 1000, 6000 grit. And yeah, learning the angle for all of those out there who are maybe thinking about getting your first Japanese kitchen knife or just a kitchen knife in general, that's probably going to be the most difficult aspect of maintaining a knife to be sharp for a long period of time, is that whenever you need to sharpen, if it's not muscle memory or even just in learning it the first time, getting the angle right might not be the most difficult aspect of it. So say this one's 16 degrees, which I believe it is 16 degrees, that's the height of a matchbook, but then it's that consistency as you move front and back. Are you keeping that angle? And in the first few times that I sharpened it, the answer was no. I did not keep that angle, and so there's definitely some whetstone bites on it. But let's go back to how did this knife enter my life? So Frankie's 16. His parents are in Paris. Will he continue talking about himself in the third person? Nope. My parents were in Paris. And when they came back from Paris, typically, when your family comes back from Paris and say you didn't get to go, they would bring you back a Parisian type gift. I'm thinking, I don't know, cheese, croissant, truffle oil, even though I've never had truffle oil, not back then. Not even sure I've had truffle oil now, probably in a pasta dish. But anyhow, what else would they bring? What's French? I don't even really know French cooking too much. Some terrine, some foie gras. No, they brought me back a Shun Classic 150mm petty made out of VG10 with a pack of wood handle and of course the rod that goes through with the steel butt. So why did they do this? Well, they did this because they knew even then, at the age of 16, that I had a huge appreciation for cooking. I would want them to leave sometimes on vacation, just so I can have the home to myself, just so I can cook. Now, I did use knives. I did cook before I was 16, right? So make no mistake. Oh, also, by the way, just because I can feel it in hand, and this might be the only knife that has such a handle, it's a D-shaped handle, for the record. So yes, I did cook before the tender age of 16, and with some of the knives that I cook with, I'm gonna put up on screen. As you'll notice, I haven't really changed. I mean, sure, I've aged, but this next picture, I think it's kind of comical. Clearly, I've always had a thing for less clothes. We were born this way, and so I will maintain myself this way. Of course, I wasn't born with tattoos, for those of you that are confused. I don't want anyone to have any identity crises out there. So yes, so I did use, prior to receiving this knife, I did use the kitchen knives that my parents owned. Not even sure what they were, to be honest. Even looking at the pictures, I'm still not sure what they were. But one thing I can tell you, this is what they were. It was the type of knife that you go to a box store and you buy a set of 7 with the knife block. That much I know, so I really can't think of it. I'm trying to remember the logo and I got nothing. But this was the first knife that I owned. And so this, well, it started all of this. It started what is now a 40+ kitchen knife collection. And so where did I go from here? So of course I used this knife. I used it religiously. I used it carefully. I used it cautiously, despite the whetstone marks. That's just part of the learning process. I always kept it in its box. That much I remember. I know that I did not have a knife bar at the time. And then from here, so Shun now, right, you have to remember, Shun is all I know now, right? I grew up, I saw the blocks of 7 knives, the bread knife, the 3 petty knives that are all sensibly the same size, varying 10 millimeters with a slightly different blade profile. And then I got my knife, the Shun Classic. And so of course, even though the internet existed back then, it's not like I knew where to look. I had heard of knives like Global and Wusthof, but I wanted to stick to Shun because I was told this is a Japanese knife. Back then, I didn't make the distinction factory made versus handmade. I didn't care. I was just happy that I had been obsessed with Japan. And then 2 years later, I got my first Japanese kitchen knife. And so I stuck to Shun. And so I think I didn't really make any purchases until, so I was 16. I joined the band, The Real Deal, 17, 18. Stayed there doing the best career of my life for about 6 years. And then when I decided to go back to school, to join university, despite wanting to avoid having to go back to school, but it ended up being the right choice, even in retrospect, even though I didn't want to go back to school. The point is, I figured the least I could do is try to reward myself for sticking with it, for still going to school, for not quitting. Be like, good job, Frankie, another semester done, 10 to go. And so I decided that my theme, what I was going to do, the way I was going to add a knife to my collection was going to be to add another Shun of a knife style that I don't own. And they already had quite a few collections back then, so from a collection that I did not own. So if I'm not mistaken, and I should probably look at the timestamps on these photos, but after the Shun Classic, I believe that the next knife that I added to my collection, which would then make it a collection of 2 at the time, would have been a 165mm Shun Premier Tsuchimi finished Santoku. The handle, to be honest, was, I can, again, just look this up, but I want to go from memory, probably just some dyed pack of wood again. So I added the Santoku. Then a few semesters probably went by, and I do remember that I was really proud of this 3rd edition to the collection, just because it was an absolutely stunning knife. It was my first Damascus. It also had what they called a samurai family emblem pin in the handle, right? Samurai for sure. Probably not just, it was probably just a cherry blossom. And this was now, size-wise, if this is 150, it would have probably been 120mm Shun Reserve. Yes, with the SG2 Damascus. And the handle, well, the handle is what you see up on screen. Again, I could look it up. I'll probably just put in the video description. Top of mind, I can't remember. Now I'm just starting to think that as much as I thought all those handles look fancy, it was probably just all a different variation of packwood. So that was knife number 3. And then knife number 4 that I added to my collection of Shuns, this one was by far my favorite. at the time, I had wanted to learn how to sharpen a bit better, right? Of course, because of the whetstone bites, I was just going off of basically just experience. I was experimenting. I hadn't really looked up any resources, but I said, Frankie, I want to get better. What can I do about it? Well, I Googled, and a tutorial on Chubo knives showed up. And I started to watch those videos religiously. And then there was a man in the video resources on Chubo knives that I came to learn was Chef Chris Constantino of a San Francisco famous restaurant where he did a lot of head-to-tail cooking. So I became obsessed with Chef Chris Constantino because he was also, I don't think we called it that at the time, but he was a Shun knife ambassador. And then eventually came the Shun Blue line, and Chef Chris Constantino showed how 2 of those knives operated in a kitchen setting. I became obsessed with that knife, one of the knives, and I bought myself for the 4th knife to add to the Shun collection, the Shun Blue Honesuki. I feel like it was under 150 millimeters, to be honest. And that became my favorite knife. It was also the first knife that came, if I'm not mistaken, again, with the saya. Remember, I keep saying if I'm not mistaken, I'm going back a few years. And then that was it. That was my collection of 4 Shuns. So by the time I added the Shun Blue Honesuki, I wasn't done my Bachelor's of Science degree yet. I know that Becca and I, had we started dating in 2014 before I got my first handmade Japanese kitchen knife? Essentially where I went from my collection of 4, so now at 16 I got the Shun Classic. I'm about 26. So 10 years later, my collection's only at 4. Man, if only I could go another 10 years now. Like, I'm 36 now. If I could, in the next 10 years, just get 4 more knives, whew, we'd be joking. I wouldn't even call it a collection at that point. Yeah, now I'd be lucky to not go 6 months without 4 knives. That's not the point. So I had gone 10 years since my first acquisition, which was really a gift. Grew my collection to 4, and then I decided to buy my first handmade Japanese kitchen knife. And that was thanks to, again, I think it was just some weird Google search that led me to an Etsy website of a handle maker, because really that's what he was, Chris Weidmark out of Ontario, out of Ottawa specifically. Or I say specifically, I think he was close to Ottawa, not so much in Ottawa. Still some of the best custom handles that I've seen to date. And funny enough, I was purchasing knives from him at the time with custom handles, and no one was really doing it. So he was ahead of the curve. I was ahead of the curve, but I didn't know I was ahead of the curve, nor do I think he was. Sadly, he retired many, many years ago. But from my Shun Classics, I think that's why this collection just went outrageous after this next step, which was probably the best step I could have done, because I see a lot of value in the knives that I own. But the next step was when Chris Weidmark had convinced me that as a first handmade Japanese kitchen knife, a knife that I should purchase would be the Masami Asai 170 millimeter Giotto out of VG10 Damascus. Absolutely beautiful knife. Of course, that was forged by the late Masami Asai. He's no longer with us, sadly, but I do now own 2 of his knives. That knife in particular, which you'll see on screen, of course, had a sandalwood handle. So that's my first diving into the handmade Japanese kitchen knife world, and also a taste of takufu, though at the time I didn't know that this knife was made in Echizen, essentially. Also, one of Masami Asai is also one of the original founders of the Takufu Knife Village, along with some of our heroes like Takeshi Saji and Katsushige Anryu. From there, and I won't tell you the story of every single knife, but it's to explain why this knife means so much. From there, the next deep dive I took was getting my first custom handle on another handmade Japanese kitchen knife. And that custom handle was a curly blue-dyed maple burl. Do some of you know what knife I'm talking about? I recently, and by recently probably already a year ago, knocked it off to put another handle on. So that handle was on originally a 165 millimeter Teruyasu Fujiwara Maboroshi Shirogami 1 Sentoku. So that was my first deep dive into custom handles. And I never turned back. That was probably the best decision after getting into the handmade Japanese kitchen knife world. And I tell you, when you get a custom handle, it really completes the piece. And again, as you can tell, I'm someone who doesn't really like to wear garments, but shoes are important to me. I couldn't care less what I'm wearing. I mean, that's not true. The point is, I don't like to dress up. I don't like suits. I like a t-shirt, shorts, and my Vans old schools. And to me, a nice custom handle is just like the shoes on the person, right? It completes the outfit. And having a nice pair of shoes does matter. So having a nice handle does matter. And to me, custom handles, for the most part, is the way to go. There are some exceptions, like we see here on your left. The beautiful Tagayasen Yo handle on this Giro is absolutely phenomenal, and that's made in the shop, as well as this beautiful handle from Konosuke. This one is, what's the wood? Kurogaki. So there are some exceptions, but for the most part, I haven't been too crazy about some of the knife handles that are stock handles coming out of some Japanese handmade shops. And so yeah, that was my deep dive essentially into the handmade Japanese kitchen knife world, custom handles, what started it all. From there, all I have left to say essentially, thank you for just listening to me talk about how my obsession got out of hand. But from there, what I decided to do as I added more handmade Japanese kitchen knives to my life is I got rid of all the Shuns. I sold them, but I had to keep the OG. I had to keep the one knife that meant the most to me. I had to keep the one knife that I thank my parents for giving to me, because they now have no excuse to say, you have too many Japanese kitchen knives. Because I can just do the childish thing and be like, you started it. So thank you guys for joining me. I hope that's given you some insight into why I am the person that I am today, owning so many Japanese kitchen knives, and where the obsession started. So 22 years of Japanese culture obsession, 20 years of Japanese kitchen knife obsession, 15 years now of photography, and it's only been the past 3-4 years that I've kind of converted all my accounts to really mainly be about Japanese kitchen knives and food. And so unlike the Shun, when I got this 20 years ago and then started photography 5 years after, there is no knife that I add to my collection these days that almost does not get any video time or photo time. So that part I'm super happy about, because I found it very strange. I spent hours looking for pictures of the Shun Classic. Barely anything. Thanks again, guys, for hanging out with me on my 20-year obsession journey story. And until then, see you next time.